on critical thinking. Why is critical thinking so important, particularly now? Well, I'll just select two of the many reasons. One is that we live in a period of extremely rapid change, technological, communication, social, political, and those who are going to be successful and happy in the future need to be very flexible in their thinking. They need to adapt, to change, to assess situations, to be creative, innovative, and that is all part of the package of critical thinking to help you adapt in this turbulent world. A second reason is because of the flood of information, both true and false and half-true, which we encounter every day. And as a result, we have to, much more than ever before, differentiate, separate off fake news from real news, from half-real news. So we have to be much more discriminating than when I grew up. So those are two reasons for critical thinking. But what is critical thinking? Here is a sort of definition from one of the dictionaries I looked up. Critical thinking is the ability to think clearly and rationally, understanding the logical connection between ideas. It mentions that critical thinking is part of Western philosophy from Plato and Socrates to the present, and this is absolutely true, but it is not so much part of the tradition of Chinese or Japanese or Asian philosophical thinking. It is something which is a new kind of thinking, and therefore, particularly for Chinese and people in Asia, it is a little bit more of an effort to be a critical thinker, because my education and my background taught me this right from the start, but it is not the Confucian or ancient traditions of the East. Critical thinking might be described as the ability to engage in reflective and independent thinking. In essence, critical thinking requires you to use your ability to reason. It is about being an active learner rather than a passive recipient of information. Critical thinkers rigorously question ideas and assumptions rather than accepting them as face value. They will always seek to determine whether the ideas, arguments, and findings represent the entire picture and are open to finding that they are not. Critical thinkers will identify, analyze, and solve problems systematically rather than by intuition or instinct. This is the goal, critical thinking, of much of the education that I both received and gave over the years at my schools, my primary school even, and certainly at my secondary school, boarding school, and then at Oxford for 6 years as a historian, and then 6 years retraining at London University in anthropology. And then finally, for the nearly 40 years that I taught at Cambridge University as a university lecturer and professor in anthropology, I was teaching my students critical thinking. So how do you do critical thinking? That is the big question. And I'll give you a few of the ways in which I think I tried to teach this and how I learnt it. The first, I tell my students, is the dialectical method. The dialectic is a way of thinking where you put forward a hypothesis and then counter that hypothesis with an antithesis, and then you bring together the best of both into a synthesis. It's the method that Karl Marx, for example, used, among others. And when I teach my students, I say a really good essay, you are asked a question, what do you think were the causes of the English Civil War or the Second World War or the Renaissance or whatever it is? And in the first part of the essay you say, well, some people say it was caused by this, and this is their argument. That's the thesis. Then other people say, no, that's wrong. These are the reasons for that phenomenon. So you summarize the arguments for both sides of a problem, and then in the last part, the really important part, in the synthesis, you give your own view. And you shouldn't be shy about it, I tell my students. Maybe you don't know as much as your teachers or the great experts, but you should express your own opinion. So you then say, I think that this view is better than that view. I think that they have forgotten about this. I would emphasize that. So you really put forward an independent judgment. And critical thinking is an exercise of judgment. That's one method, and a very important one. And if you do that with many problems that face you, even daily life problems, if you're asked to do something and you're not sure whether you should do it, put forward the arguments for and against, and then come to your own conclusion. Just to give you one example, when the great thinker Charles Darwin was wondering whether to marry his cousin Emma, he got a sheet of paper and he put 4 reasons why he should marry her, against reasons why he shouldn't marry her, and then his conclusion, which was that he should marry her. It's on the back of my book on marriage and love in England. A second approach is the comparative approach. This is something which is very important, particularly in anthropology. You always look at problems in comparison to something else. We do this all the time. We are comparative thinkers. And this is making that explicit. So there are 2 forms of comparison. Whenever you meet some item you have to assess, try and then say, well, how does it compare to something else? And there are 2 major dimensions along which you can make those comparisons. One is in time. So you look at the phenomenon, you look at, for example, the response to COVID, or you look at the war that is going on in Ukraine, and you put it into history comparatively. So with the war in Ukraine, for example, you say, well, what is the history of that area, and how does this particular set of tensions that is occurring at the moment compare to what the situation was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and so on. And if you do that, it illuminates the moment you are considering in the present. And also it tends to diffuse your anxiety about it, because you see, for instance, we have a cost of living crisis, we're told, in England at the moment, prices going up very fast and so on. But if you look at it comparatively, you see that we have been through many worse crises in the past, that we are much more affluent than we were 30, 40 years ago, even when I was a child. And so you set it into a comparative framework and you understand the present better in relation to the past. The other form of comparison is in space, and this is particularly important in anthropology. So whenever you are looking at a problem within your own culture or society, then you try and find out how this problem or this subject compares to something elsewhere. So again, if I was looking at the cost of living crisis and worrying about not being able to heat my house as much as I normally did and so on, I would then make sure that I watched the news and read about how people in other parts of the world are facing this crisis. And the obvious fact is that when you look at our problems in this country, and then you look at the situation, the most dire situations after the floods in Pakistan, or the droughts in China, or the terrible situation in the Horn of Africa with Ethiopia and Somalia, and millions on the verge of starvation, it puts it all into perspective. And also it has another effect, comparison, which is deeper, which is that it illuminates your own world by showing you that many of the things you take for granted, very, very familiar, it makes them unfamiliar, it distances them, and you begin to question them, which is about part of the critical apparatus, questioning. So you question things which you've always done, your normal everyday life, which you take for granted, your relations with your parents, for example. For instance, in England, I just take it for granted that human beings grow up in very small families, and you leave home when you're quite young, and you remain friends with your parents, but you no longer are expected to abide by everything they say or support them all the time. And then I look at India or China or elsewhere, and I discover my pattern is unusual. Only very small parts of the world have a family system like this. So it makes your own system unfamiliar. And on the other hand, the comparative method brings the unfamiliar towards you. You can begin to understand other parts of the world which seemed entirely strange by comparing them to your own. And so you can become more understanding and tolerant of other places and people. And so it's all a matter of putting the particular problem into a wider context, widen the lens outwards, and many problems, difficulties, subjects will become both more interesting and more soluble by that widening. A third approach is what I call a structural approach. Now, structural has many meanings, but in this sense, and it's taken from the French idea of structuralism, the idea here is that instead of looking at a thing in itself, A, you look at that thing in relation to something else, B, and it's not the two things that you're looking at, it is the relation between the two things, so A/B, and that is the important thing, the slash. An example is in which is where structuralism came into my discipline of anthropology, was through linguistics. And so you had a theoretician, de Saussure, who said that the important thing in linguistics is this structural relation. That is, you have the signifier, which is, say, the word rose, the signified, which is the rose itself, and what he called the sign, that is the relation between the word rose and the actual rose, and the sign is the important thing to look at. That kind of way of thinking, whereby you look always at a relation between things, say between the political situation and the economic situation, or between the social world and the religious world. So you're constantly bringing different spheres of our lives together. And that way of thinking is very stimulating. This is a case where some traditions, particularly Asia, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and to a certain extent, considerable extent, India, do in their philosophy and traditions have a much more structural approach to things. Chinese poetry, for example, is deeply structural. Every little piece of the writing is a pictogram or a logogram, tiny sign, is not to be taken in itself, but it relates to something else. All Chinese and Japanese art is structural. And this is true also across much of Europe, the continent French, and that is why structuralism is so much a part of the French tradition through its philosophies up to the present. Whereas what I call the Anglosphere, the British and Americans, are much more individualistic, positivistic in their thinking. So they think about things in themselves. They conceive of human beings as single entities, whereas in much of Asia, you are what you are in relation to someone else. Just to take an example, where I worked in the Himalayas, you don't talk about people by their names. You talk about them by their relationships. So you don't refer to someone as Buddhi Bahadur. You say the son of Dilmaya, eldest son of so-and-so. It's the relationship that is important, and that's the case in all the family system, but also throughout the society. So this structural approach to things will make you think afresh. Another important way of increasing the power of your analytical and rational and critical thinking is through what I call analytical or backwards reasoning. This is a method I got from the great detectives like Sherlock Holmes, and the idea here is that in many of the disciplines we face, not in the physical sciences, but in the biological and zoological sciences and in all the humanities, where most problems consist of, you have a phenomenon, you have a war, you have an epidemic, you have something happening, and then you try and understand what caused it. And in order to do that, in a detective story, you have someone's murdered, and then the detective tries to find the chain of reasoning backwards. So they look at the clues in the murder scene, and then they go back along a chain until they come to the person who has done the murder. And sometimes it's 3 or 4 or 5 links in the chain. Sometimes there are, and nearly always, there are 5 or 6 different causes. So if you were looking, for instance, at the war in Ukraine, then you wouldn't just look at one cause. You would look along a chain of 4, 5, 6 different links which had causal chains which had led up to this final conclusion. Another way to improve critical thinking is to widen and narrow your vision. By that I mean, if you think of ourselves as floating a little way above problems that we want to solve, the best way to solve them is to perhaps go right down into very detailed look at the problem. So you would look at the minute details, and this is what, again, detectives do. Sherlock Holmes went to the crime scene, and Sherlock Holmes went to the crime scene, and he looked at the tiny details, the bit of ash on someone's sleeve, or a little tear in the coat, or whatever. And often he even used a magnifying glass to do this. So you look at the detail and make sure you get the detail right, and then you start widening out. And if you imagine yourself floating above the problem, you've gone right down to the minute, and then you go out to a high level and you look right round the problem, and then you can see it in comparison to other things and into context. If you imagine you are in a wood, in a forest, you first look at a particular leaf, a particular tree, a particular detail, and then you go up out of the forest above it and look down at the whole of all the trees and their shape. And by doing this not once but going up and down is the way that I've solved many of the problems I've been faced with. Another important method that I was taught, particularly in history, was the need to cross-question the evidence. The famous philosopher and of history and writer Mark Bloch said that we should be like judges cross-questioning a suspect. And this was an idea that was also used by the founder of modern science, one of the founders, Francis Bacon. You cross-question the evidence. You are vigilant, you are suspicious, you don't trust what the person or the document says. And Mark Bloch says when you get a piece of evidence, a bit of document saying something, you don't just say, oh, well, that's true. You say, well, who wrote it? Why did they write it? What effect were they hoping to have? How did they know? Where did they find their information for? How does it stand up if we compare it to other bits of information on the same subject? So you summon facts, and this in our daily life now, of course, is very difficult to do because you are given a piece of information and you have to react very quickly because of the speed of things. But to take a recent example, there was an allegation that the Russians had fired a missile into Poland, which would have been the cause of another world war if it had been true and taken seriously. And it was accepted by some journalist in America who was later sacked. But they paused, they looked at further evidence, and they cross-questioned the evidence, and they found that in fact it was probably a Ukrainian missile that had gone the wrong way, or counter-missile. So cross-question everything. Don't believe what you read just because someone has said it. Find out who has said it, why they said it, why and how they know, and be skeptical. It's not easy thing to do. I remember the shock of being taught this as a child at school, because I'd been very trusting of newspapers and other sources, and then someone said, well, you can't trust newspapers, and you can't even trust what looked like good statistics. There's an English saying, lies, damn lies, i.e. really bad lies, and statistics, which says, statistics are the worst form of lying. And we were taught later with things like images. We were taught first that the camera never lies, but later we were taught that the camera lies all the time. That is the nature of all art and even mechanical devices like cameras, because the angle, the lighting, the framing, all that is influencing what you see. So question every image and every speech. And finally, be very aware of absences and silences. When you're told something or you read something, say, well, what is not there? What am I not being told? What is the absence? And here again, a nice example is from detective stories, the famous story of Sherlock Holmes, who went to investigate why and how a prize racehorse had been stolen in the middle of the night. And the clue that he finally picked up was not something that was there, but something that was not there. And this was that the dog that was sleeping near the horse did not bark. And that told him it must have been stolen by someone that the dog knew. So the dog that did not bark in the night is an English saying, meaning look at things that don't happen as well as things that do happen. Now those are some simple guidelines for you, and if any of them interest you, I've written a series of books which are being translated into Chinese, and these are some of the English versions of them. How to Study the World, How Do We Know, and How to Discover the World. And there are about 7 or 8 of these volumes written as master's letters to young Chinese, and they're being translated. So look up my name and you might be able to find them. What I would like to end my talk with is to consider a few of the remarks of the greatest scientist of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. And he was not only a great scientist, but he did think carefully about the way in which you can practice critical thinking, how he managed to solve or lay down one of the greatest theories, the theory of general and specific relativity. And he did this despite the fact, as he said himself, and this is one of the lessons he teaches us, that he wasn't anything special. He says, I know quite certainly that I myself have no special talent. So all of us can be an Einstein. So what did he have? He had curiosity, obsession, and dogged endurance, combined with self-criticism. These, he say, have brought me to my ideas. So it was the way he thought and the way he put his emotion into his thought that made him into the great physicist that he was. So this is an encouragement to all of us. We can all do really good critical thinking if we wish. So here are a few of his guidelines on critical thinking. My favorite one is make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. The punchline is in the but not simpler. And if you think about this, you realize that this is what all art and all science and all human communication is about. It's about, we are faced with huge diversity and complexity and a million, billion, trillion facts and things happening, whirring around us. What we need to do in order to understand the world and to communicate is to simplify them, to get at the essence. just bringing it down to E equals mc squared. That's all we need to know. But when you're simplifying it down, don't take it too far. Don't leave out the squared at the end of E equals mc, otherwise it's nonsense. So art and science is bringing it down to the level at which it is a simplification of reality, of course, but not an oversimplification. Another important idea I got from him is it is better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And this applies to critical thinking. When, as we are faced with tremendous time pressures, space pressures, information pressures. If we become too obsessed with getting things perfectly right, then we will be overwhelmed and we won't achieve very much. But if we try to roughly get it right, not perfectly right, but good enough, then we will be able to achieve a great deal and solve many problems. And that's very, very good advice. It's well known that in solving most problems, it is the last 1%, getting the last 1 or 2% right, takes as much time as the first 98%. And therefore we shouldn't bother. To take an example with my students, I say to them, look, if you write a good essay, but don't go back over it and rewrite it in the attempt to make it into a perfect essay. It's much better to write 2 good essays, good enough essays, than 1 perfect essay. When we mark our examinations, then you can only get out something out of 100, so if you get 2 70s, it's much better than getting 1 100 and then a 20 because you haven't time for the next essay. So make things as good as you can, but at a certain point you realize from now on it's going to be a huge amount of effort for little reward. In economics, this is called the theory of diminishing marginal returns, a point at which further effort becomes less and less worthwhile. The next saying of his is, the only source of knowledge is experience. Now that's not something you would normally think. You would think, well, the source of knowledge is what's behind me here, all these books and information coming to me through normal sources. They are important as well, and it's an exaggeration to say the only source of knowledge, but certainly experience, and that means doing things. So I know from my own life that the experience of growing up, of things like games and sports and arts and all those things, is just as important as the book knowledge which I got in my classes. So things outside the classes were terribly important. And another form of enormously important experience for me has been travelling. And the 20 visits I have made to Nepal and the 17 visits I have made to China and 8 visits to Australia and so on. Each of these visits and the experiences of meals, of friendships, of beautiful places have gone into my thinking about the world and helped me to be a critical thinker. So widen your experience as much as possible. Another interesting idea in terms of critical thinking is when he says, unless an idea starts off as absurd, that is crazy, there is no chance for it. Now, most of us are taught to play safe, to just think, well, this is a safe idea, this is a safe action, and that's okay through much of life. You don't want to go helter-skelter doing crazy things all the time. But if you are approaching really critical and innovative thinking, then you have to think the absurd, the crazy. And that's for an obvious reason. If you just go along the conventional, obvious, sensible ways of thinking of everyone else, then your ideas will not be original or creative, and millions of people will have thought them before, and you will have absolutely no effect, and you won't understand anything new. What Einstein did, and I've interviewed many scientists and they all say the same thing, is they try out crazy ideas. I interviewed the person who worked closely with the man, Thomas Crick, who co-discovered DNA. And he said, Crick and I just spent the whole time talking and thinking of crazy ideas, and we'd put it up on the blackboard, and the other would say, no, that's too crazy, that doesn't work. And Einstein himself says this is how he worked. He would generate dozens, 100 crazy ideas. 99 were no use, then one worked. And so when you are faced with a problem or something you want to think about, think of the obvious answers, but then think of something crazy. Because certainly when teaching at Cambridge University, I look for craziness in my students. That is to say, someone who is, in the cliche of the moment, thinking outside the box. They're not boxed in by conventional ideas, but they think outside it. And that is a very important part of critical thinking. Einstein says the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. Never lose a holy curiosity. And that was one of the things he isolated as important in his own contribution. Curiosity. Once you find you are becoming bored and stale, then move on to something else, because it is curiosity, trying to understand something and really being passionate about that, that will make you into a critical thinker. One that I really like, and I will end with, is that problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. In other words, if you are trying to solve the problem of ecological destruction and the warming of the planet and so on, if you just remain at that level of ecology and warming, you will never solve that problem. You have to go up a level and look at that problem within the context of many other things. In my own case, for example, I would look at that problem in relation to warfare. How much are we spending on international weapons and war? And do we need to spend all that money? If we spent 1/10 of that on preserving our planet, many, many things would be changed for the better. So rise above the problem and think about it at another level. So I've given you advice from my own experience through my lifetime of learning and teaching, and there will be many other things you learn. Remember, don't be overcritical. You need to be critical, but if you become too critical of everything and distrusting and skeptical about everything, then your life will not be happy. and keep your criticisms to yourself to a large extent. Critical thinking and criticism is not the same thing. You are careful about what you believe and how you believe it, but you don't go around pushing that at other people. Otherwise, you will get the reputation for being too cynical and critical. So it's a balance, as with all things in life. So I hope that one or two of those ideas will be helpful to you. Thank you for listening. Bye.